March 1945. The European war was moving into its closing chapter. Allied forces were tightening their grip on the Rhine, Germany's final great natural defensive line. Every senior commander understood one thing: once the Rhine was crossed, the defeat of Nazi Germany was only a matter of time. Almost all of them believed the crossing would require weeks of careful planning, huge stockpiles of supplies, and massive troop buildups before even attempting it. All except one. General George S. Patton believed he needed only courage, boats, and soldiers willing to march straight into danger. What unfolded next, and what British Prime Minister Winston Churchill later muttered when he heard, perfectly explains why Patton was both adored and despised by Allied leadership. This is the story of a commander who ignored the rulebook, defied military tradition, and forced Britain's leader to admit that sometimes the rules were meant to be broken. March 22, 1945, 10 p.m. Along the Rhine River near Oppenheim, Germany, Patton stood on the western shoreline, watching engineers ready their assault craft. For weeks, the Third Army had been racing eastward, advancing faster than supply columns could replenish them, faster than intelligence officers could analyze, and far faster than Allied headquarters had expected or approved. Now Patton was nearly 50 miles south of his assigned sector. He had selected a river crossing point that no one had cleared, was organizing an operation no one had authorized, and was about to launch an assault that violated nearly every accepted principle of modern warfare. He planned to cross the Rhine without air cover. Without a preliminary artillery or bombing campaign. Without massive troop concentrations. Without even alerting Eisenhower until it would be too late to stop him. His staff officers were deeply uneasy. His corps commanders were electrified. And his soldiers trusted him absolutely.
Because this type of daring maneuver was exactly what Patton had become famous for: fast, unpredictable, seemingly reckless by textbook standards, yet unstoppable once Patton committed to it. 6 hours earlier, Patton had been poring over maps at Third Army headquarters when his forward reconnaissance units. Continue when you're ready. I can rephrase the next part too. Scouts soon delivered astonishing news. The bridge near Oppenheim had been damaged, yet enemy resistance along that stretch of the river was minimal. German troops were massed far to the north, preparing to confront Montgomery's massive, highly publicized river assault near Wesel. The southern portion of the Rhine was, for all practical purposes, barely defended. Patton recognized the opening immediately. Cross the river before German reinforcements could arrive. Secure a foothold on the eastern shore before Supreme Headquarters had time to order him to stand down. Force Eisenhower to accept a fait accompli. Seize the Rhine not through long preparations, but through velocity and boldness. His chief of staff, General Hobart Gay, voiced the obvious concern. "Sir, we do not have approval to attempt a Rhine crossing. The current strategy calls for regrouping, stockpiling supplies, and coordinating movements with neighboring armies. If we act without clearance, Eisenhower will be furious." Patton's reply would become legendary. "I don't need permission to chase a defeated enemy. What I need are boats and soldiers willing to climb into them. Get me both. We move tonight." "But sir, Supreme Headquarters? Montgomery's operation? The coordination plan?" Patton turned with a look that his officers recognized instantly, the look that meant the debate was over. "Hobart, I will be across the Rhine before Montgomery even begins his attack. I'll do it using a fraction of his manpower. And I will demonstrate that speed and surprise defeat slow, methodical planning every single time. Now bring me those boats." March 23, 1945, 2 a.m. The first American troops slipped across the Rhine at Oppenheim. There was no opening artillery barrage to announce their arrival. No airstrikes to weaken enemy positions. No massive cannon fire lighting up the sky. Only quiet infantrymen in assault craft gliding across dark water reaching the eastern bank before German sentries fully understood what was unfolding. By sunrise, a battalion had crossed. By midday, an entire division stood on the far shore. By nightfall, Patton had secured a bridgehead stretching 3 miles inland and still expanding. German counterattacks were scattered, poorly organized, and ineffective. Third Army engineers were already assembling pontoon bridges to carry tanks and heavy equipment across the river. Only then did Patton notify Eisenhower. The message was short and casually irreverent. "Dear Ike, I have just relieved myself in the Rhine. For heaven's sake, send fuel." At Supreme Headquarters, Eisenhower read the note and felt the familiar storm of emotions Patton always triggered: anger at the disobedience, respect for the accomplishment, irritation at the disregard for procedure, and relief that the gamble had succeeded. His chief of staff, Bedell Smith, was far less diplomatic. "That reckless devil just crossed the river without authorization, without preparation, and without coordination. He has violated every operational rule we established." Eisenhower studied the map displaying Patton's expanding bridgehead. "Yes," he replied quietly, "and he has also just shortened the war by several weeks, perhaps even by months." Montgomery's assault was scheduled to begin the following day using 30,000 soldiers, more than 3,500 artillery guns, and overwhelming air support. George had already crossed the night before using little more than small boats and foot soldiers. Who, then, had truly achieved the greater success? Smith had no reply. March 24, 1945. Operation Plunder, Montgomery's massive Rhine offensive, commenced. The difference between his approach and Patton's could not have been more dramatic. Montgomery had invested weeks in preparation. He had gathered enormous manpower. British and American airborne troops were scheduled to drop behind enemy lines. Thousands of artillery cannons were positioned to obliterate German defenses. Naval units stood ready to add additional firepower. Nothing was left to uncertainty. The operation achieved its objectives. Montgomery's forces crossed the Rhine with losses considered acceptable, secured solid bridgeheads, and began driving deeper into Germany. By all accepted military standards, Operation Plunder represented a flawless model of planning and execution. Yet everyone was aware of one uncomfortable truth. Patton had already crossed the Rhine 24 hours earlier using only a small fraction of Montgomery's resources. The psychological blow to British military pride was severe. Once again, the Americans, and in particular that outspoken cavalryman general so often criticized, had outperformed the slow, calculated British method. Winston Churchill happened to be visiting Montgomery's headquarters when word of Patton's crossing arrived. The Prime Minister had come to observe Operation Plunder, to celebrate British strength, and to stand beside Montgomery during what was meant to be a historic triumph. Instead, the first question posed by war correspondents asked whether Churchill wished to comment on Patton having crossed the Rhine ahead of Montgomery. Just as in Sicily, just as during the dash to the German frontier, just as in every contest where the two commanders' campaigns overlapped, Churchill's public statement was carefully measured. General Patton's initiative deserves praise. Every Allied crossing of the Rhine advances us towards certain victory. Both American and British forces have performed superbly. Privately, however, witnesses recorded a far less restrained response. March 25, 1945. Churchill insisted on crossing the Rhine himself. Despite warnings from his security detail, despite the real danger of active combat nearby, and despite Montgomery's concerns, the Prime Minister demanded to be taken across the river. He wanted to place his foot on German soil. He wanted to experience the historic crossing firsthand. Montgomery arranged for Churchill to cross at a relatively safe sector. With a cigar clenched between his teeth, the Prime Minister rode over a pontoon bridge, stepped onto the eastern bank of the Rhine, and then deliberately relieved himself into the river. Cameras captured the act, a defiant, symbolic gesture marking Britain's presence deep inside Germany. Later, back at Montgomery's headquarters, Churchill met with his senior commanders to review the unfolding situation. Maps displayed both Montgomery's bridgehead and Patton's position farther south. Patton's Third Army was already more than 20 miles beyond the Rhine, capitalizing on their earlier crossing, pushing farther into the heart of Germany. Churchill examined the charts quietly. Then he shifted his gaze toward Montgomery. "Bernard, clarify something for me. You were given months to design this campaign. You were provided massive assets. You conducted careful and detailed preparations. Yet General Patton, operating with far less planning and far fewer supplies, crossed ahead of you and is now significantly farther into German territory. How do you explain this?" Montgomery stiffened at the implied rebuke. Prime Minister General Patton's maneuver was irresponsible. He accepted unnecessary danger. He ignored established military doctrine. He advanced without sufficient preparation or support. The fact that it succeeded does not justify his behavior. Churchill drew deeply on his cigar, weighing the answer. Then he delivered the question that struck at the core of the issue. But it did succeed, didn't it? His so-called recklessness placed American forces across the Rhine a full day before our carefully organized operation. His disregard for protocol has now carried his troops more than 20 miles deeper into Germany than our textbook advance. So I ask again, how? The chamber went quiet. No one volunteered a reply. At last Churchill spoke again, his tone gentler, almost thoughtful. For 4 years I have observed this conflict unfold. I have witnessed elegant strategies collapse and desperate gambles triumph. I have learned that war is not an equation. It is psychology, timing, and sometimes an uncompromising refusal to accept what is claimed to be impossible. He gestured toward the map marking Patton's bridgehead. That American commander understands something we frequently overlook: the enemy also has a say. When we spend weeks assembling a massive offensive, the opponent sees it forming and prepares in response. When we strike suddenly with limited forces at a lightly guarded point, we achieve surprise, and surprise, gentlemen, often wins battles that sheer numerical superiority cannot. Churchill paused, then added the words later recorded in numerous diaries and memoirs. George Patton is difficult, defiant, self-important, and exhausting to manage. But he also carries something rare and invaluable among military leaders: the instinct to recognize opportunity and the courage to seize it immediately, regardless of what the rulebook demands. One of Churchill's close staff members, John Colville, later recorded that the Prime Minister continued talking almost as if he were thinking aloud. We British take pride in strict military order. We produce lengthy operational directives. We synchronize every movement. We reduce danger through exhaustive preparation. These habits are strengths. Yet there are moments, perhaps more frequently than we care to admit, when wars are decided by leaders who are willing to abandon manuals and simply strike. Montgomery attempted to justify his doctrine. Prime Minister, casualty figures in thoroughly planned operations are considerably lower than in rushed assaults. General Patton's approach costs lives. Churchill turned toward him, his expression both gentle and resolute. Bernard, you have secured tremendous victories through methodical preparation, in North Africa, in Sicily, in Normandy. I am not attacking your methods. But look closely at that map. Patton crossed the Rhine with comparatively light losses precisely because no one expected him to attempt it. The Germans were unprepared because they believed no one would be reckless enough to move without overwhelming preparation. What conventional thinking would label his recklessness actually spared lives by achieving total surprise. The Prime Minister rose and approached the map, tracing Patton's route with his finger. I have been reflecting on this since I heard of his crossing. Do you know what troubles me most? It is not that an American commander reached the Rhine before us. It is that I find myself wondering whether British military culture has become so devoted to procedure that we have lost the ability for this level of daring. He turned back toward the assembled officers. When Napoleon was once asked which trait he valued most in generals, he replied, first, luck. I believe he meant something deeper. What appears to be luck is often nothing more than the bravery to seize brief opportunities that cautious men allow to slip away. Patton has that bravery. It makes him difficult to tolerate and extraordinarily effective. Later that evening, Churchill met privately with his senior military aide, General Hastings Ismay. Ismay's diary preserved the conversation in detail. Churchill was reflective, holding a glass of whiskey, studying maps of the Rhine crossings. Pug, he said, using Ismay's nickname, there is something I must tell you, and it must never appear in any official record. Ismay listened. Churchill continued. I am envious. Not of Patton as a man, heaven knows I would not want to command him, but I am. Churchill admitted he felt envious that the Americans had a commander with such an aggressive, offensive drive, while even our finest generals, brilliant as they were, had grown overly cautious. Ismay began to raise an objection, but Churchill dismissed it with a hand gesture. Do not misunderstand me. Montgomery is an outstanding general, exceptional at orchestrated battles and skilled at minimizing losses through meticulous planning. Yet, when I consider who would have charged across the Rhine on a whim, with insufficient forces and overwhelming odds, only one Allied general comes to mind, and he is American. Churchill took a deliberate sip of his whiskey and continued, "We British once produced commanders of that caliber. Wellington possessed that bold, attacking instinct. Nelson demonstrated it clearly. Somehow, we have lost that edge. Today, we administer battles rather than act as warriors." Patton is a throwback to an older age, a time when generals led from the front, relying on intuition instead of staff analyses. Is that a positive trait, Prime Minister? Ismay asked cautiously. Churchill paused, reflecting deeply. In total war, Pug, in a conflict where the survival of civilization itself is at stake, yes, it absolutely is. Patton's methods would be intolerable in peacetime. They would be reckless in a limited war. But in this fight, where ending Nazi Germany quickly is paramount to saving lives and preventing further horrors, leaders like Patton are exactly what is required. Ismay recorded that Churchill then offered a revealing insight: "For 2 years, I worried we might lose this war. Now, my concern is that we are taking too long to win it. Every additional month prolongs the suffering and death." Patton's audacious Rhine crossing, risky though it was, likely saved more lives by hastening the war's conclusion than Montgomery's careful planning did by minimizing casualties. That is the grim arithmetic of command. On March 26, 1945, Churchill returned to London. During a war cabinet meeting, he briefed political and military leaders about his visit to the Rhine. His formal report commended both Montgomery's meticulously prepared operation and Patton's daring initiative. However, during informal discussions that followed, Churchill expressed his genuine opinion. Several cabinet members had voiced complaints regarding Patton's insubordination, his disregard for proper chains of command, and his unsanctioned operations. Churchill listened patiently but knew where he stood. Churchill listened patiently and then spoke words that would become widely cited in British military circles. "Gentlemen, General Patton is guilty of every accusation you have made. He is insubordinate, reckless, difficult to manage, and constitutionally incapable of following orders he disagrees with. Eisenhower would likely be justified in relieving him of command for his actions. But here is the uncomfortable truth: if we had a general like Patton, we would have crossed the Rhine first. We would be further into Germany, and the war might have ended weeks sooner. So before we criticize him too harshly, we must ask ourselves why we lack leaders of his caliber." When someone asked whether Churchill considered British generals inferior to their American counterparts, he replied immediately and decisively, "Not inferior, simply different. Our military culture values careful planning, meticulous preparation, and keeping casualty rates acceptable. Those are important qualities, but they carry a cost. The cost is that we sometimes move too slowly, prepare too thoroughly, and let opportunities slip away while we perfect our plan." He continued, "The Americans, especially Patton, approach war differently. They prioritize speed over perfection, accept greater risk for faster results, and rely on audacity to make up for insufficient preparation. It's a cultural distinction. Neither method is inherently superior. Yet in this conflict, against this enemy, Patton's style is achieving results faster." A cabinet member then asked the obvious question: should British military doctrine change? Churchill's reply was characteristically nuanced. "Rules exist for good reasons. Proper planning saves lives. Coordination prevents friendly fire. Logistics sustain operations. But rules are tools, not commandments. When following them improves outcomes, follow them. When breaking them achieves faster victory, you must have the courage to break them. The challenge is knowing which situation you are in. That is what separates good generals from great ones." Patton possesses that instinct. Whether it is genius or madness often only becomes clear in hindsight. By April 1945, as the Third Army advanced deep into Germany, capturing city after city faster than any modern army, Churchill's view of Patton shifted from grudging respect to genuine admiration. The Prime Minister wrote to President Roosevelt, "By now, you have undoubtedly heard about Patton's Rhine crossing and his subsequent rampage through Germany. The man is impossible to manage, infuriating to coordinate with, and yet astonishingly brilliant in exploitation warfare. He has demonstrated that aggressive commanders with limited resources can accomplish more than cautious commanders with overwhelming forces. It is a lesson I wish we had learned sooner. Churchill also sent a personal note to Eisenhower: "Your man Patton has vindicated every frustrating decision we questioned. His audacity, speed, and instinct have shown that sometimes, breaking the rules produces results that meticulous planning cannot. You should be proud of him." Restructured for flow and readability. Churchill acknowledged that every decision Eisenhower made to keep Patton in command, despite the general's controversies, had been justified. Patton's crossing of the Rhine would be analyzed for generations as the ultimate example of operational boldness. For years, Churchill had believed that overwhelming force was the key to victory, but Patton had proven that sometimes speed, audacity, and decisiveness matter more than sheer numbers. In his private diary, Churchill was even more candid: "I have been reflecting constantly on Patton's Rhine crossing, not solely because of its military significance, though it certainly was decisive, but because it forced me to confront uncomfortable truths about British military culture. Have we become too cautious, too attached to protocol, too fearful of casualties?" Patton's success suggests that the answer may be yes. That is a bitter revelation for a nation that once commanded an empire through bold, audacious military campaigns. May 8, 1945 Victory in Europe Day. Nazi Germany surrendered unconditionally, bringing the war in Europe to a close. Allied forces had achieved total victory. Millions poured into the streets of London, New York, Paris, and Moscow to celebrate. The nightmare that had gripped Europe for years was finally ending. Churchill delivered his historic victory speech to the British people. He praised Montgomery, the British forces, and the Allied coalition as a whole. Patton was mentioned only briefly, in the context of American contributions. Yet that evening, during a private dinner with his closest advisers, Churchill raised his glass in a toast that several attendees would later recall. To the generals who won this war, Montgomery, who showed that meticulous planning could prevail, Eisenhower, who held together an almost impossible coalition, and George Patton, who demonstrated that sometimes the best plan is to strike immediately with whatever forces are at hand. The man broke every rule we hold sacred, thank God he was on our side. Someone asked Churchill whether he believed Patton would have succeeded in the British Army. His answer was instant and emphatic: absolutely not. Our system would have either broken him or he would have broken it, probably both. Patton succeeded because the American military, despite its rules and regulations, still allows room for mavericks. We British have rules, and we adhere to them. That makes us reliable, but it sometimes makes us slow. Churchill paused, then continued thoughtfully: "During this war, I have learned that different circumstances demand different types of commanders. When you need a steady hand, methodical planning, and minimized casualties, you choose Montgomery. When you require explosive speed, calculated risks, and the ability to unnerve the enemy, you choose Patton. The art of high command lies in knowing which leader to employ for each situation." When asked specifically about the Rhine crossing, Churchill smiled faintly: "That situation required exactly what it received: a general bold enough to cross a major river without authorization, without proper preparation, and without adequate support. A general who, upon seeing an opportunity, simply said, 'To hell with the rules. We're going now.' Montgomery would have spent 2 weeks planning. Those 2 weeks would have allowed the Germans to reinforce. Patton's audacity was precisely the right audacity, at precisely the right moment." In his post-war memoirs, Churchill devoted considerable reflection to this episode, acknowledging that Patton's daring initiative not only shortened the war but also highlighted the contrast between cautious procedure and decisive action. Churchill devoted considerable thought to analyzing the dynamics of Allied command. His evaluation of Patton was nuanced, critical in parts, yet ultimately admiring. General Patton embodied a kind of military leader that had become increasingly rare in modern warfare. He combined personal bravery with operational audacity in ways that directly defied contemporary military doctrine. His Rhine crossing perfectly illustrated this approach: minimal preparation, maximum aggression, and total commitment once the decision was made. By conventional military standards, his methods might appear reckless. By results-oriented standards, they were extraordinarily effective. Churchill continued, "The British military tradition prizes careful planning, meticulous preparation, and calculated risk management. These principles have served us well throughout the war." Yet Patton's achievements force us to confront some uncomfortable questions about the balance between procedure and initiative. The question arose whether our strict focus on proper procedure sometimes causes us to miss critical opportunities. Patton's Rhine crossing accomplished in mere hours what conventional methods might have required weeks to achieve. The lives saved by hastening the end of the war likely outweighed any casualties caused by the rapid, audacious maneuver. Then came Churchill's final judgment, words that captured his ultimate perspective on Patton. History will debate George Patton's legacy for generations. He was controversial, insubordinate, and often exasperating to his superiors. Yet he was also one of the finest exploitation commanders any army has ever produced. When opportunity presented itself, Patton seized it with a speed and force that disoriented enemies and amazed allies alike. He deliberately broke rules because he understood that rules are tools to achieve victory, not ends in themselves. That understanding, combined with his tactical genius and personal bravery, made him an invaluable asset to the Allied cause. We were fortunate that he fought for civilization rather than against it. March 22, 1945, the night Patton crossed the Rhine without authorization, was not the largest battle of World War II, nor the most strategically decisive operation. Other crossings involved more troops, greater planning, and larger resources. Yet Patton's Rhine crossing symbolized something far deeper about military leadership, about taking calculated risks, about the courage to bend or break rules when the situation demanded it. Churchill grasped this truth instantly. The Prime Minister, who had dedicated years to directing Britain's war effort, coordinating closely with Stalin and Roosevelt, and balancing political demands with military realities, recognized that Patton's Rhine crossing represented far more than a mere tactical victory.